I got an unknown call. Get to the other side of town to find your son lying on the ground in freezing rain. My daughter-in-law had locked him out until he passed out. So I made her taste the same cold. 10 times worse. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened that December night was just the tip of an iceberg that had been forming for months. I had always prided myself on being the kind of mother who didn't interfere. At 62, after 35 years of teaching high school English, I knew when to step back and let people make their own mistakes. When Michael married Stephanie 3 years ago, I smiled at their wedding, welcomed her into our family with open arms, and told myself that any concerns I had were just typical mother-in-law worries. Looking back now, I realize those weren't worries.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
They were warnings. The first red flag came 6 months after their wedding. Michael had always been punctual, almost obsessively so. He inherited that trait from his father, along with his gentle nature and his tendency to see the best in people. But suddenly, Michael started arriving late to our monthly dinners. Not just a few minutes late, but 45 minutes, an hour, sometimes not showing up at all. Stephanie gets anxious when I leave, he'd explain, his voice carrying a strain I'd never heard before. She worries about me driving alone at night. I found this odd since Michael had been driving alone for over 20 years, but I kept my mouth shut. Stephanie would sit beside him during these explanations, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. She had this way of tilting her head when she looked at me, like she was studying a particularly interesting insect. "Bridget understands, don't you?" she'd say, using my first name instead of calling me Mom like she had during their engagement. Family is so important, and Michael's family is just us now. Just us now, as if I had somehow been demoted from family to acquaintance. The second red flag was Michael's appearance. My son had always been lean but healthy. By their second year of marriage, he looked gaunt. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. When I asked about it, Stephanie was quick to answer. "Michael's been having some health issues," she'd say, her voice dripping with concern. "Nothing serious, just digestive problems. I've put him on a very strict diet to help him feel better." Michael would nod along, but I noticed he never looked at me when she spoke about his health issues. He'd stare at his hands, at the floor, anywhere but at my face. And when Stephanie left the room, he'd grab whatever food was available and eat like he hadn't seen a meal in days. The third red flag was the isolation. Michael had always been social, with a close group of friends from college and work, but gradually, those friends stopped being mentioned in conversation. When I asked about Tom, his best friend since freshman year, Michael's face would tighten. "Tom doesn't really understand our lifestyle," he'd say. And again, Stephanie would chime in. "Some people are threatened by close marriages," she'd explain. "They try to create problems where none exist. We've had to distance ourselves from negative influences." Negative influences. That's what she called anyone who might question what was happening to my son. But the night of December 15th, all those red flags burst into flames. I had never been the type to make unexpected visits. I believed in calling first, respecting boundaries, giving people their privacy. But that Tuesday evening, I found myself driving to Michael's house without really knowing why. Call it mother's intuition, call it divine intervention, call it whatever you want. Something told me I needed to check on my son. The house was dark when I arrived at 8:30 p.m. No lights in the windows, no warm glow from the television, nothing to indicate anyone was home. But both cars were in the driveway, Michael's old Honda and Stephanie's sleek BMW. I sat in my car for a moment, wondering if I should leave. They were probably just watching a movie, or maybe they'd gone to bed early. Then I heard it. A soft sound, almost lost in the wind. A moan, weak and desperate. I got out of my car and followed the sound around to the back of the house. What I found there will haunt me for the rest of my life. Michael was lying on the wooden deck behind their house, curled into a ball, shivering violently. He was wearing only a thin t-shirt and pajama pants, soaked through from the freezing rain that had been falling for hours. His lips were blue, his skin pale and waxy. He was barely conscious. "Michael!" I rushed to him, dropping to my knees beside his trembling form. "Oh my God, what happened?" What are you doing out here?" His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on my face. When recognition dawned, tears started flowing down his cheeks. "Mom," he whispered, his voice so weak I had to lean close to hear him. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what, honey? We need to get you inside right now. You're freezing." I tried to help him sit up, but his muscles seemed to have stopped working properly. The shivering was so violent it looked like he was having seizures. I had seen hypothermia before, during my years teaching in northern Minnesota, and I knew this was serious. "Can't," he managed between chattering teeth. "Door's locked. Can't get in." "What do you mean the door's locked? It's your house." But even as I said it, I was trying the back door handle. Locked. I pounded on the glass with my fist, shouting Stephanie's name. Through the window, I could see lights on in the front of the house. She was home, she was awake, and she was leaving my son to freeze on their back deck. "Stephanie!" I screamed, pounding harder. "Open this door right now." Nothing. No response, no movement, no acknowledgement that she could hear me. I pulled out my phone and called 911, then tried to shield Michael's body with my coat while we waited. He kept drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling apologies, and what sounded like promises to be better and follow the rules. "What rules, Michael? What are you talking about?" But he couldn't answer coherently. The cold had taken too much out of him. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, the same time that Stephanie finally appeared at the back door. She opened it slowly, as if she'd just woken up, though she was fully dressed, and her makeup was perfect. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice filled with practiced surprise. "What happened?" I was in the front room watching TV with headphones. I had no idea anyone was out here. The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly, so convincingly, that for a moment I almost believed her myself. But I had been pounding on that door for 15 minutes. No headphones in the world could have blocked out that sound. As the paramedics worked on Michael, checking his vitals and wrapping him in heating blankets, I watched Stephanie's performance. She played the concerned wife perfectly, hovering close enough to seem caring, but never actually touching him. When the paramedics asked what happened, she had her story ready. "Michael's been having some episodes lately," she said, her voice trembling with just the right amount of worry. "Anxiety attacks, you know? Sometimes he goes outside to calm down and loses track of time. I've been trying to get him to see someone, but you know how men are about therapy. Episodes, anxiety attacks. As if my son's near death from hypothermia was just another quirk she had to manage. "Ma'am," one of the paramedics said to me, "are you family? I'm his mother. We're taking him to St. Mary's. His core temperature is dangerously low. You might want to follow us." As they loaded Michael into the ambulance, Stephanie climbed in beside him. Just before the doors closed, she looked back at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "Thank you for finding him, Bridget," she said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up, but I did know. I knew exactly what would have happened. My son would have died on that deck, and Stephanie would have claimed it was a tragic accident. A man with anxiety problems who went outside during a panic attack and lost track of time. The perfect crime, wrapped in the perfect lie, delivered by the perfect sociopath." As I followed the ambulance to the hospital through the freezing rain, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, I made a promise to myself and to my son. I was going to find out exactly what Stephanie had been doing to Michael. I was going to document every lie, every manipulation, every moment of cruelty. And then I was going to make sure she experienced the same cold isolation she had been inflicting on my son. But I had no idea how deep her cruelty ran, or how perfectly she had crafted her web of control. What I discovered over the next few months would test every skill I had learned in 35 years of teaching, every ounce of patience I had developed, and every bit of strength I thought I possessed. Because Stephanie wasn't just a bad wife. She was a predator, and my son was just her latest victim. The first thing I noticed when Michael woke up in the hospital was how he ate. I had been sitting beside his bed for 18 hours straight, watching the monitors that tracked his slowly rising body temperature, listening to the steady beep of machines that confirmed he was still alive. The doctor said he'd been maybe 30 minutes away from organ failure when the paramedics found him, 30 minutes away from becoming another tragic statistic. When he finally opened his eyes on Wednesday afternoon, the first thing he did was apologize. "Mom, I'm sorry you had to see that," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "I didn't mean to worry you." Before I could respond, a nurse came in with a lunch tray. Standard hospital food, chicken broth, crackers, vanilla pudding, apple juice. Nothing fancy, nothing appetizing to most people, but when that nurse set the tray down, Michael's entire demeanor changed. He didn't just eat the food, he devoured it, like someone who hadn't seen a meal in weeks. He drank the broth straight from the bowl, not bothering with the spoon. He ate every single cracker, licking his fingers to catch the crumbs. He scraped the pudding cup so clean it looked like it had been washed. "Slow down, honey," I said gently. "The food isn't going anywhere." He paused, a cracker halfway to his mouth, and looked at me with the most heartbreaking expression of shame I'd ever seen. "Sorry," he said again. I haven't been very hungry lately." But this wasn't the eating pattern of someone with no appetite. This was the eating pattern of someone who had been systematically deprived of food. Over the next 3 days, as Michael's body slowly recovered from the hypothermia, I started noticing other things. Details that painted a picture I desperately didn't want to see. There were marks on his hands, small, circular scars on his fingertips that looked like frostbite damage, but old, healed, as if he'd been exposed to extreme cold multiple times before. There were pressure sores on his hip bones and shoulder blades, the kind you see in bedridden patients who aren't turned regularly. But Michael wasn't bedridden. He was a 32-year-old man in otherwise good health. And then there were the things he said when he thought he was alone. I had stepped out to get coffee from the machine down the hall, but I forgot my purse and came back to grab it. Michael was asleep, or so I thought, but he was talking, mumbling words that made my blood run cold. "I promise I'll remember next time," he whispered to no one. "I won't forget to ask permission. I won't call Mom without asking first. Please don't make me go outside again. Please, Stephanie, I'll be good." I stood frozen in the doorway, listening to my grown son beg his wife for basic human dignity in his sleep. When the night nurse came in to check his vitals, I pulled her aside. "The marks on his hands," I said quietly, "and those pressure sores. Have you seen injuries like that before?" She was young, maybe mid-20s, with kind eyes and the sort of gentle manner that made patients trust her immediately. She glanced around to make sure we weren't overheard, then nodded slowly. "Ma'am, I probably shouldn't say this, but..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "In my training, we learned to recognize signs of domestic abuse. Your son's injuries, combined with his behavior patterns, it's concerning." "What kind of behavior patterns?" "He flinches when anyone approaches him quickly. He asks permission before drinking water or using the bathroom. He apologizes constantly, even for things that aren't his fault. And the way he ate." She shook her head. "I've seen that before. In patients who've been subjected to food restriction." Food restriction. The clinical term made it sound almost medical, almost reasonable, but what it really meant was starvation. Controlled, deliberate starvation used as a weapon. "There's something else," the nurse continued. "When his wife visits, his vital signs change. His heart rate increases, his blood pressure spikes. The monitors show stress responses consistent with fear. Fear. My son was afraid of his own wife. That night, after Stephanie had left from her daily visit, I searched through Michael's belongings. His clothes had been cut away in the emergency room, but the personal items he'd had in his pockets were in a plastic bag in the bedside table. What I found there confirmed my worst suspicions. Folded into a small square and tucked into his wallet was a piece of paper covered in Stephanie's handwriting. At the top, in neat block letters, it said, "House Rules." Below that was a list that made me physically sick. No phone calls without permission. No leaving the house without permission. No eating between designated meal times. Bedroom door must remain open at all times. Lights out by 9 p.m. No contact with outside family without prior approval. Violations result in correction time. At the bottom of the page, in different colored ink as if it had been added later, was a note. Correction time. Back porch. Minimum 2 hours. Longer for repeat violations. Correction time. That's what she called leaving my son outside to freeze. I photographed the list with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to take the picture 3 times to get it clear. Then I carefully folded it back exactly as I'd found it and put it back in his wallet. The next day was Friday, Michael's 4th day in the hospital. The doctor said he could probably go home over the weekend if his temperature remained stable and he showed no signs of infection. I dreaded that moment, knowing what home meant for him. Stephanie arrived for her usual afternoon visit, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and wearing the same concerned wife expression she'd perfected. She kissed Michael's forehead gently, asked how he was feeling, and settled into the chair beside his bed with a heavy sigh. "I'm so worried about you, baby," she said, taking his hand in hers. "These episodes are getting worse. I think when you come home, we need to establish some better routines to help you stay calm." Episodes. There was that word again. Her way of reframing abuse as mental illness. "I've been thinking," she continued, "maybe we should limit your activities for a while. No unnecessary stress, no unplanned outings. I'll take care of everything so you can focus on getting better." I watched Michael's face as she spoke. He nodded along, agreeing to his own further imprisonment, and I could see the fear in his eyes. Not fear of his condition, but fear of disappointing her. Fear of what would happen if he said no. "That sounds reasonable," he said quietly. "Good. And Michael," she leaned closer, lowering her voice, "I know your mother means well, but all these visits might be overwhelming for you. Maybe we should ask her to give you some space to recover." My heart pounded as I realized she was trying to cut off his last connection to the outside world. But I kept my expression neutral, continued pretending to read my magazine. "I don't want to be rude to Mom," Michael said, and I heard the careful way he phrased it. Not, "I want to see my mother," but, "I don't want to be rude." As if maintaining a relationship with me was just a social obligation he was reluctantly fulfilling. "Of course not, sweetie. We'll just explain that you need quiet time to heal. She'll understand." After Stephanie left, I sat with Michael in silence for a long time. I wanted to confront him about the list, about the marks on his hands, about the things he said in his sleep. But I could see how fragile he was, how carefully constructed his psychological defenses had become. Push too hard, too fast, and he might retreat completely. Instead, I decided to test something. "Michael," I said casually, "I was thinking of making your favorite dinner this Sunday. That lasagna with the spinach and ricotta that you used to love. Would you and Stephanie like to come over?" His face lit up for just a moment, genuine joy at the memory of that lasagna. But then the light died, replaced by anxiety. "I'd have to check with Stephanie," he said. "She's been planning our meals pretty carefully lately, for my health." "Of course, just let me know." But I already knew what the answer would be. Stephanie would find a reason why he couldn't come. She always did. That evening, after visiting hours ended, I sat in the hospital parking lot and made a decision. I pulled out a notebook, the same kind I'd used for lesson planning during my teaching years, and started writing down everything I'd observed: the eating patterns, the scars, the pressure sores, the list of rules, the things he said in his sleep, Stephanie's manipulation tactics, the fear in his eyes. I was going to document everything, every pattern, every inconsistency, every sign of abuse. Not because I planned to immediately confront Stephanie. I knew that would only make things worse for Michael, but because I was going to build a case, methodically, carefully, the way I'd taught my students to research and document their arguments. Stephanie thought she was smart. She thought she had everyone fooled with her concerned wife act, but she'd never dealt with a retired English teacher who'd spent 3 decades teaching students how to analyze, how to research, how to uncover the truth hidden beneath carefully constructed lies. I was going to learn everything there was to know about Stephanie, about her patterns, about her methods. I was going to figure out exactly how she'd trapped my son, and then I was going to free him. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Because the more I learned about Stephanie's house rules, the more I realized that what had happened on that deck wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the latest escalation in a systematic campaign of torture. And if I didn't act soon, the next escalation might kill him. Michael was discharged on Sunday morning, and I knew I was losing him. The change in his demeanor the moment Stephanie walked into his hospital room was like watching someone put on a mask. The brief glimpses of my real son, the one who devoured hospital food and mumbled apologies in his sleep, disappeared completely. In their place was this hollow version of Michael, carefully programmed to say and do exactly what she expected. "Are you ready to come home, baby?" Stephanie asked, her voice syrupy with false concern. She was carrying a small overnight bag, and I noticed she'd brought him clothes that were at least 2 sizes too big. Clothes that would hide how much weight he'd lost. "Yes," Michael replied, but he didn't look at her when he said it. "I'm ready." I helped him gather his things, moving slowly because I knew this might be my last chance to be alone with him for a while. When Stephanie stepped out to bring the car around, I took his hand. "Michael, if you ever need anything at all, you call me, day or night. Do you understand?" He squeezed my hand briefly, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of my real son in his eyes. "I know, Mom, but I'm fine, really. Stephanie takes good care of me." The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced them. But the way he said my name, Mom, instead of Mother, like Stephanie always insisted, told me he was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of conditioning and fear. 2 weeks passed without a word from either of them. I called twice, but Michael's phone went straight to voicemail both times. I drove by their house once, but the curtains were drawn and there was no sign of life. It was like they'd vanished completely. Then, on a Thursday evening, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and I answered so fast I nearly dropped the phone. "Mom!" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Michael, honey, how are you?" "I've been so worried." I'm okay. Listen, I can't talk long. Stephanie's at her book club, but she'll be back soon." The fact that he had to sneak a phone call to his own mother told me everything I needed to know about how things were at home. "Michael, we need to talk. Really talk. Can you meet me somewhere?" "I can't. I'm not supposed to." He stopped himself, but the implication was clear. He wasn't supposed to leave the house without permission. "Then I'll come to you." "No!" The panic in his voice was immediate and sharp. "You can't come here. If Stephanie finds out I called you, she'll think I'm having another episode." Another episode. Even Michael was using her language now. "Honey, what happened to you on that deck wasn't an episode. You were locked out of your own house. You nearly died." Silence on the other end. Then, so quietly I almost missed it. "I must have forgotten my key. Michael, I have to go. She's home." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long time after that call, feeling a helplessness I hadn't experienced since Michael was small and had his first asthma attack. Back then, I could rush him to the hospital, hold his hand while the doctors helped him breathe. Now, the thing that was suffocating him was something I couldn't fight directly, but I could fight it indirectly. The next morning, I drove to the public library and spent 6 hours researching everything I could find about psychological abuse, gaslighting, and coercive control. What I learned made me sick to my stomach, but it also gave me hope. Because now I understood exactly what Stephanie was doing to Michael, and more importantly, I understood that it had a name, a pattern, a documented process that other people had survived. The isolation came first. Cut the victim off from their support system. Make them dependent on the abuser for all social contact. Check. Stephanie had systematically eliminated Michael's friends and was working on removing me from his life. Then came the control of basic necessities. Food, shelter, clothing, movement. Check. The house rules I'd found proved she was controlling every aspect of his daily existence. Next was the creation of arbitrary rules and punishments designed to keep the victim constantly anxious and off balance. Check. The correction time on the back porch. Finally, the rewriting of reality itself, convincing the victim that their abuse was actually help, that their abuser was protecting them, that their own perceptions couldn't be trusted. Check. Michael now believed his near-death experience was an episode he was responsible for. Stephanie wasn't just cruel, she was methodical. This wasn't random violence or anger. It was a carefully executed psychological program designed to break down Michael's sense of self until he became completely dependent on her. The research also taught me something else. Direct confrontation rarely worked with this type of abuser. They were too skilled at manipulation, too good at turning the situation around and making themselves the victim. If I wanted to help Michael, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to document everything, build an undeniable pattern. And most importantly, I needed to understand Stephanie's own patterns so I could predict her next moves. That weekend, I started what I privately called Operation Documentation. I drove through their neighborhood at different times of day, noting which lights were on, which cars were in the driveway, any signs of activity. I wasn't stalking them. I was conducting research. The same kind of systematic observation I'd taught my students to use when analyzing literature. What I discovered was disturbing. Michael never left the house alone, ever. When they went out together, which was rare, Stephanie drove. She also did all the grocery shopping, picked up prescriptions, handled any errands that required leaving the house. Michael had essentially become a prisoner, but it was what I observed on Sunday afternoon that really opened my eyes to how sophisticated Stephanie's manipulation had become. I was parked across the street, partially hidden behind a neighbor's hedge, when Michael appeared in their front yard. He was raking leaves, working slowly and methodically, normal behavior for a homeowner on a fall afternoon, except that every few minutes he would stop and look toward the house. Not casual glances, but anxious, fearful looks, like he was checking to make sure he was still being watched. Then Stephanie appeared in the doorway. She didn't come outside, just stood there observing him. And immediately Michael's body language changed. His movements became more hurried, more desperate. He was racing to finish the job before she decided he was taking too long. When he was done, he carefully put the rake away in the garage, then approached the house. But instead of just walking in, he stood on the porch and waited, like a dog waiting for permission to enter. After what felt like an eternity, Stephanie opened the door and let him in. That's when I understood the true genius of her control system. She didn't need to lock him out anymore. She'd trained him to lock himself out, to wait for permission, to question his own right to enter his own home. That evening, I called my sister Janet, who lived across the country. We'd always been close, and she'd met Michael several times over the years. More importantly, she was a social worker who specialized in domestic abuse cases. "Janet, I need to run something by you," I said after we'd caught up on family news. Hypothetically, if someone you knew was in an abusive relationship, but they didn't recognize it as abuse, what would be the best way to help them? Hypothetically, Janet's voice carried a knowing tone. "Bridget, is this about Michael?" I told her everything. The hospital visit, the house rules, the isolation, the behavior patterns I'd observed. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. "Oh, Bridget," she said finally, "I'm so sorry. What you're describing is textbook coercive control. It's one of the most difficult forms of abuse to address because the victim often doesn't recognize it as abuse. So what do? I can't just leave him there. You document everything, which it sounds like you're already doing. You maintain whatever contact you can, even if it's minimal, and you wait for an opportunity." What kind of opportunity? Abusers like this one escalate. They push boundaries until something gives. When that happens, you need to be ready with evidence and resources. But Bridget, her voice grew serious, you also need to be prepared for the possibility that Michael might choose her over you. The psychological conditioning can be incredibly strong. After we hung up, I sat in my living room and looked at the notebook I'd been filling with observations. Dates, times, behaviors, patterns. It looked like the lesson plans I used to create, except instead of teaching students about literature, I was trying to decode the story of my son's imprisonment. The next morning, I made a decision that went against every maternal instinct I had. I stopped calling, stopped driving by their house, stopped trying to force contact. Instead, I waited, because Janet was right. Stephanie would escalate. Abusers always did. And when she made her next move, I would be ready to document it, to prove what she was doing, to save my son. But first, I needed to learn more about Stephanie herself, because the more I understood about who she really was, the better equipped I'd be to anticipate her next move. That afternoon, I drove to the coffee shop where Stephanie claimed to attend book club every Thursday evening. If I was going to understand my enemy, I needed to see her in action when she thought no one was watching. What I discovered there would change everything. There was no book club. I sat in my car outside Brewster's Coffee House for 3 Thursday evenings in a row, watching the small groups that gathered around tables with paperback novels and steaming mugs. Stephanie wasn't among them. She had never been among them, which meant that every Thursday evening when she told Michael she was going to book club, She was lying. And if she was lying about something so simple, what else was she lying about? That realization marked the beginning of the most difficult 6 months of my life. Not because of what I had to do, but because of what I had to refrain from doing. Every instinct I had as a mother screamed at me to march over to their house, bang down the door, and demand to see my son. But I forced myself to be patient, to observe, to document, because I was starting to understand that Stephanie wasn't just abusive. She was calculating in a way that suggested she'd done this before. The first pattern I noticed was her schedule. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she left the house at exactly 7:15 p.m. and returned at exactly 9:45 p.m. Always alone, always in her BMW. And always, I noticed when I drove by their house during these times, the lights in Michael's house would be turned off by 8 p.m. He was following the lights out by 9 p.m. rule even when she wasn't there to enforce it. The second pattern was more subtle. On the weekends, when the weather was particularly cold, Stephanie would leave the house for several hours at a stretch. Shopping, she would tell anyone who asked, though I never saw her return with packages. During these absences, I began positioning myself where I could observe their backyard. What I saw made my blood run cold. Michael would appear outside during these times, but not by choice. I could see him through the gaps in their privacy fence, standing on the back deck in whatever clothes he'd been wearing inside. Sometimes a t-shirt and jeans, sometimes just pajamas. He would stand there for hours, shifting from foot to foot, rubbing his arms for warmth, occasionally sitting down on the deck steps when his legs got tired. But he never tried to break down the door, never tried to find shelter, never even called for help, though their neighbors were close enough to hear. He just stood there and endured it, like he believed he deserved it. The third time I witnessed this, I almost broke my own rule about not interfering. It was a particularly brutal February day, with wind chills below zero and snow falling steadily. Michael had been outside for over 2 hours, and I could see him starting to show signs of hypothermia again, the same uncontrollable shivering I'd witnessed that night in December. I had my phone in my hand, ready to call 911, when Stephanie's BMW pulled into the driveway. She sat in her car for a full 10 minutes after arriving, letting Michael continue to freeze while she checked her makeup in the rearview mirror. Only when she was satisfied with her appearance did she get out and unlock the back door. Michael stumbled inside, and I didn't see him again for the rest of the day. That night, I added another entry to my documentation notebook. February 18th, 2:15 to 4:30 p.m. Michael left outside in below-freezing temperatures for 2 hours and 15 minutes while Stephanie claimed to be shopping. No shopping bags observed upon her return. By March, my notebook contained detailed records of 17 separate incidents where Michael had been locked outside in freezing weather. The shortest duration was 45 minutes. The longest was nearly 4 hours. But it wasn't just the cold exposure that I was documenting. It was everything. I documented the way Michael never appeared in their front yard when neighbors were outside. I documented how their grocery deliveries always came when Stephanie was home, and how Michael was never the one to answer the door. I documented the fact that Michael's car hadn't moved from their driveway in over 3 months. Most importantly, I documented the neighbors. There were 6 houses on their street, and I made it my business to get to know the residents of each one. Not in an obvious way. I wasn't going door to door asking questions about Michael and Stephanie. Instead, I became the friendly woman who occasionally walked her sister's dog through the neighborhood when she was visiting. Mrs. Chen, who lived directly next door, was a 73-year-old widow who spent most of her day sitting by her kitchen window. She had noticed things. "That poor young man next door," she told me during one of our conversations over the fence. "Something's not right there. I see him outside at all hours, just standing in the cold. His wife drives by sometimes when he's out there, but she doesn't stop to let him in." "That does sound strange," I agreed, careful not to reveal my connection to Michael. "Have you ever spoken to them about it?" I tried once. Asked the wife if everything was okay. She said he has some kind of mental condition that makes him forget his keys. Mrs. Chen shook her head. But I've been married for 50 years, and I know the difference between forgetfulness and fear. That boy is afraid. Mr. Rodriguez, who lived across the street, had noticed the pattern too. The husband used to wave when I was working in my yard, he told me. Friendly guy. Always had a smile, but I haven't seen him smile in months. Now, when he comes outside, he keeps his head down. Won't make eye contact. When does he come outside? I asked. Only when his wife isn't home. And even then, he acts like he's expecting to get in trouble for it. These conversations confirmed what I'd been documenting. Michael's isolation wasn't just psychological, it was physical and social as well. Stephanie had turned him into a ghost in his own neighborhood. But the most revealing conversation came from Jenny Morrison, a 30-something mother of two who lived at the end of the street. I used to work with Stephanie, Jenny told me, before she got married. We were both at Davidson Marketing for about a year. My pulse quickened. This was the first person I'd met who knew Stephanie from before her relationship with Michael. What was she like as a co-worker? I asked, trying to sound casually interested. Jenny glanced around as if making sure we weren't overheard. Honestly, she was. Intense. Really focused on advancement, you know. But there was something else. She dated this guy from accounting, Brad something. Really sweet guy, kind of shy. What happened to him? That's the weird part. After they'd been together for maybe 6 months, he just changed. Stopped coming to office parties, stopped eating lunch with the rest of us. He got really thin, started looking exhausted all the time. Some people thought he was on drugs. My heart was pounding now. And then, he quit suddenly. No notice, no explanation. Just cleared out his desk one Friday and never came back. When people asked Stephanie about it, she said he'd had a nervous breakdown and moved back in with his parents. A nervous breakdown. The same explanation Stephanie was preparing for Michael's eventual disappearance from his own life. Did anyone stay in touch with him? A few people tried, but he'd disconnected his phone, deleted his social media. It was like he just vanished. Jenny paused. You know what the really strange part was? About a month after Brad left, Stephanie started dating someone new. Another shy, quiet guy from a different department. And within a few months, the same thing happened to him. Weight loss, isolation, exhaustion. What happened to the second guy? Same thing. Quit without notice, disappeared completely. Stephanie said he'd decided to find himself and moved to another state. 2 men, 2 relationships. 2 mysterious disappearances preceded by the same pattern of isolation and control that I was witnessing with Michael. Stephanie had done this before, maybe more than twice. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open, connecting the dots between Jenny's story and my own observations. The pattern was clear. Stephanie systematically destroyed men, broke them down psychologically until they were completely dependent on her, and then somehow made them disappear from their own lives. The question was, what was her endgame with Michael? Was she planning to make him disappear too? Or was she content to keep him as a permanent prisoner, a trophy of her ability to break another human being? I needed to find out what had happened to Brad and the other man from Stephanie's past. Because if I could prove that she had a pattern of this behavior, if I could find evidence of what she'd done before, maybe I could build a case strong enough to free Michael. But more urgently, I needed to figure out what Stephanie was really doing during those Tuesday and Thursday evening absences. Because whatever it wasn't book club, and I had a growing suspicion that it had something to do with her long-term plans for my son. The next Tuesday evening, instead of driving by their house, I followed Stephanie's BMW when she left at 7:15. What I discovered would explain everything and give me the weapon I needed to finally fight back. Stephanie was hunting for her next victim. I followed her BMW through the winding streets of downtown, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to see where she went. She drove with purpose, someone who knew exactly where she was headed. After 15 minutes, she pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Pub, a quiet neighborhood bar known for attracting young professionals after work. I parked across the street and watched through the large front windows as Stephanie took a seat at the bar. She'd changed clothes since leaving the house. Gone was the casual sweater and jeans she'd worn at home, replaced by a form-fitting black dress and heels. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked like a woman on the hunt, and she was. Over the next 2 hours, I watched Stephanie work the room with practiced efficiency. She approached men who were sitting alone, men who looked lonely or vulnerable. She would start conversations, laugh at their jokes, touch their arms in a way that suggested intimacy. But it wasn't random. She was evaluating them, testing them, looking for specific qualities. Shyness, isolation, the kind of gentle nature that could be exploited. Around 9:30, she settled on her target for the evening, a thin, bookish man in his 30s who'd been nursing the same beer for over an hour. He wore glasses and a slightly rumpled button-down shirt, and when Stephanie approached him, his face lit up with surprised gratitude that someone so beautiful was paying attention to him. I watched her work her magic. The practiced smile, the carefully timed laughs, the way she leaned in close when he spoke as if everything he said was fascinating. I'd seen this performance before. It was exactly how she'd behaved around Michael during their early courtship. She was recruiting her next victim. I drove home that night with my hands shaking, finally understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. Stephanie wasn't just an abusive wife. She was a predator who systematically hunted vulnerable men, broke them down psychologically, and then moved on to the next target when she grew bored or when they became too damaged to provide whatever satisfaction she derived from their suffering. But Michael was different. She'd been with him for 3 years now, longer than the previous relationships Jenny had described, which meant either she'd found something in Michael that made him worth keeping long-term, or she was planning something more permanent than just abandoning him. The thought that came to me then made me physically sick. What if Stephanie wasn't planning to leave Michael? What if she was planning to eliminate him entirely? I thought about the hypothermia incidents, each one more severe than the last. I thought about how easily she could claim he'd had another episode and wandered outside during a blizzard. How she could play the grieving widow, devastated by her husband's tragic mental illness, the perfect crime, committed in plain sight, with a built-in explanation that everyone would accept. I couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, I called Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychiatrist who'd consulted on domestic abuse cases that my sister Janet had worked on. I explained the situation carefully, providing the documentation I'd gathered over the past 6 months. "What you're describing sounds like severe, coercive control," Dr. Martinez confirmed after reviewing my notes. "But the challenge is that victims often don't recognize it as abuse, especially when it's been this systematic. Direct confrontation rarely works. It usually just drives them deeper into denial. So, what do I do? You need to create a situation where the victim feels safe enough to acknowledge what's happening to them. Often that means removing them from the controlled environment temporarily. How? Medical intervention is one of the most effective methods. If you can get him to a hospital or treatment facility where she can't manipulate the narrative, where he's surrounded by trained professionals who can recognize the signs of abuse. That conversation planted the seed of my plan. I began monitoring the weather reports obsessively, waiting for the perfect storm, literally. I needed conditions severe enough to guarantee hypothermia if Michael was left outside, but I also needed to be prepared to intervene before it became fatal. The opportunity came in late March, during a late-season blizzard that the meteorologists were calling the worst storm in decades. Snow was predicted to fall at a rate of 3 inches per hour, with wind chills dropping to 30 below zero. I knew Stephanie would use this storm. The pattern had been escalating, and conditions like this were too perfect for her to resist. I spent the day making preparations. I contacted Dr. Martinez and explained my plan. I called Janet and asked her to be on standby. Most importantly, I reached out to Detective Ray Morrison from the Domestic Abuse Unit, someone Janet had recommended. "I can't make an arrest based on your suspicions alone," Detective Morrison explained when I called him. "But if we catch her in the act, if we can document the abuse happening in real time, that's different. Are you sure you want to take this risk?" "I'm sure. Then here's what we'll do." By 6 p.m., I was positioned in my car 3 blocks from Michael and Stephanie's house, with Detective Morrison parked 1 street over. Dr. Martinez was waiting at the hospital emergency room, briefed on the situation, and ready to provide immediate evaluation. At 7:15 p.m., right on schedule, Stephanie's BMW pulled out of their driveway. I waited exactly 30 minutes, then drove to their house. The neighborhood was deserted. Everyone with sense was inside, safe from the storm that was now dumping snow at an alarming rate. I parked where I could see their backyard and called Detective Morrison. "She's gone. I'm in position. Remember, we need to catch her returning while he's still outside. The timeline is crucial for proving intent." I sat in my car, watching their backyard through the gaps in the fence, my heart pounding as the minutes ticked by. The snow was falling so heavily now that visibility was down to just a few feet. The wind was howling, creating drifts that were already several feet high. At 8:45 p.m., I saw movement in their backyard. Michael appeared on the deck, wearing only jeans and a thin sweater. Even from a distance, I could see him shivering violently within minutes of stepping outside. He tried the door handle, locked, as I'd known it would be, then sat down on the deck steps, hunching his shoulders against the wind. I started a timer on my phone and began documenting everything. The time, the weather conditions, Michael's clothing, his behavior, every detail that would be needed for the legal case we were building. On 15 p.m., Michael had been outside for 30 minutes. He was now lying on the deck, curled in a ball, barely moving. 9:30 p.m., 45 minutes. I could no longer see Michael moving at all. 9:35 p.m., Stephanie's BMW turned onto their street. I called Detective Morrison immediately. "She's coming back. He's been outside for 50 minutes in blizzard conditions. We're moving." Stephanie parked in her driveway and sat in her car for several minutes, just as she always did. But this time, Detective Morrison and I were watching from opposite sides of the street as she checked her makeup, while my son lay unconscious in the snow behind her house. When she finally got out of her car, Detective Morrison was there. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Morrison with the County Sheriff's Department. We've received a report of someone in distress at this address." Stephanie's carefully composed expression faltered for just a moment. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. There's no one in distress here. We'd like to check on your husband, please." "My husband is inside, sleeping. He's been feeling unwell." Detective Morrison gestured toward the backyard. "Ma'am, we can see him from here." The look that crossed Stephanie's face when she realized we could see Michael was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Pure rage, quickly masked by her practiced concern. "Oh my God," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "He must have had another episode. He gets confused and goes outside sometimes. I had no idea he was out there." But Detective Morrison was already moving toward the backyard, and I was right behind him. We found Michael unconscious in the snow, his core body temperature dangerously low, his breathing shallow and irregular. As the paramedics worked to stabilize him, Detective Morrison turned to Stephanie. "Ma'am, you're telling me you didn't know your husband was outside in this storm?" "I was out," she said, sticking to her story. "I just got home. He must have gone out after I left. Your neighbor called this in over an hour ago." Detective Morrison lied smoothly. "She saw him go outside at 8:45. Where were you between 7:15 and 9:35? For the first time since I'd known her, Stephanie was speechless. As they loaded Michael into the ambulance, I climbed in beside him. This time, Stephanie wasn't invited. This time, there would be trained professionals evaluating Michael's condition, documenting his injuries, asking the right questions. This time, I had witnesses, evidence, and a detective who understood exactly what we were dealing with. But most importantly, this time Michael would be in a controlled environment where Stephanie couldn't manipulate the narrative, where he might finally feel safe enough to tell the truth about what she'd been doing to him. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time in 6 months, I felt like we were winning. Michael woke up on Thursday afternoon, 3 days after we'd found him unconscious in the snow. This time, when he opened his eyes, I was ready. Dr. Martinez sat beside his hospital bed, her credentials and calm authority filling the room with a sense of safety that even Stephanie couldn't penetrate. Detective Morrison stood near the window, his presence a reminder that this wasn't just a family matter anymore. It was a criminal investigation, and for the first time in months, Stephanie wasn't controlling the narrative. "Michael," Dr. Martinez said gently. "I'm Dr. Martinez. I specialize in helping people who've experienced trauma. Your mother and Detective Morrison have shared some concerns about your safety at home. We'd like to hear your perspective. I watched my son's face as the careful programming Stephanie had installed began to crack. Without her there to reinforce the lies, without the constant fear of saying the wrong thing, the truth started bleeding through. I don't. He began, then stopped. His eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. I'm fine, really. Stephanie takes good care of me. Michael, Detective Morrison said, stepping closer to the bed. We found you unconscious in your backyard during a blizzard. You'd been outside for nearly an hour in sub-zero temperatures. Can you tell us how that happened? I must have forgotten my key, Michael said automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. The lie sounded hollow even to him. Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. Michael, I want you to know that nothing you say here will get you in trouble. We're not here to judge you or blame you for anything. We're here because we're concerned about your well-being. Something in her tone, the gentle authority of a professional who'd seen this before, finally penetrated the wall of fear Stephanie had built around my son's mind. Michael started, then stopped, his hands trembling. She says I have episodes, that I get confused and do dangerous things. What do you think? Dr. Martinez asked. Do you feel confused when these things happen? Michael was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. No, I remember everything. I remember all of it. And then, like a dam bursting, the truth came pouring out. He told us about the house rules, about the punishments, about the systematic isolation from friends and family. He described being locked outside in increasingly severe weather, standing on that deck for hours while Stephanie sat inside, sometimes watching him through the window. He told us about the food restriction, meals reduced to one small portion per day when he misbehaved. About being forbidden to leave the house, to make phone calls, to maintain any relationships outside of his marriage. Most heartbreakingly, he told us about the psychological manipulation, how Stephanie had convinced him that he was mentally unstable, that his own perceptions couldn't be trusted, that she was the only person who could keep him safe from his own dangerous impulses. She said if I told anyone about our arrangement, they'd have me committed, Michael said, tears streaming down his face. She said no one would believe me anyway because she was taking such good care of me. And she was right. I mean, look at me. I let this happen. I'm weak. No, Dr. Martinez said firmly. You're not weak. You're a survivor. What you've described is called coercive control, and it's a sophisticated form of psychological abuse. The fact that you endured it for so long shows incredible strength, not weakness. Detective Morrison pulled out his notebook. Michael, I need to ask you some specific questions. The information you give me will help us build a case to make sure this never happens to you, or anyone else, again. Over the next 2 hours, Detective Morrison documented everything. The physical abuse, the psychological manipulation, the pattern of escalating violence. Michael described incidents I hadn't even known about. Times when Stephanie had locked him in the basement overnight, times when she'd thrown away his medications and told him he didn't deserve them. But it was when Detective Morrison showed Michael the photographs I'd taken, pictures of him standing outside during previous storms, that my son finally understood the full scope of what had been done to him. You were watching? He asked me, his voice breaking. I was documenting, I corrected gently. I was building evidence to prove what she was doing to you. Because I knew that when the time came to fight back, we'd need more than just our word against hers. Detective Morrison nodded. Your mother's documentation is what made this case possible. Without it, we'd never have been able to prove the pattern of abuse. That evening, while Michael slept under medical supervision, Detective Morrison and I sat in the hospital cafeteria discussing next steps. We have enough evidence to charge her with domestic abuse, reckless endangerment, and psychological torture, he said. But there's something else. I did some digging into her background, following up on the information you provided about her previous relationships. My pulse quickened. What did you find? Brad Matthews, the accountant from her first documented relationship, didn't just disappear. He's living in a psychiatric facility in Oregon. Severe PTSD, unable to function independently. The staff there says he's terrified of women, has panic attacks if anyone tries to touch him. And the second man? David Park. He's alive, but barely. Living with his parents, hasn't left their house in 2 years. When I contacted him about Stephanie, he had a complete breakdown, started screaming about the rules and correction time. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't planning to kill Michael. She was planning to break him completely, to destroy his mind so thoroughly that he'd never be able to function without her. That's my assessment as well, and based on the escalating pattern we documented, she was close to succeeding. The next morning brought a confrontation I'd been preparing for months. Stephanie arrived at the hospital with flowers and her usual mask of concerned devotion. But this time she found Detective Morrison and Dr. Martinez waiting for her, along with Michael and me. "Mrs. Henderson," Detective Morrison said, using her legal name, "you're under arrest for domestic abuse, reckless endangerment, and psychological torture." The transformation was instant and terrifying. The mask of sweetness fell away completely, replaced by something cold and predatory that I'd only glimpsed before. "You have no idea what you're doing," she snarled at me. "Michael needs me. Without me, he'll fall apart completely. You're destroying him." "No," Michael said, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. "You destroyed me, but I'm going to rebuild myself." As they led Stephanie away in handcuffs, she turned back one last time. "This isn't over," she called out. "I'll find you, Michael. I'll find you and bring you home where you belong." But it was over, because by that afternoon, we'd learned that Detective Morrison had found something else in his investigation, evidence that Stephanie had been documenting her abuse methods, keeping detailed notes about psychological manipulation techniques that she planned to use on future victims. The man I'd seen her targeting at Murphy's pub was contacted and warned. Her employer was notified of her arrest. Her carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbled completely, leaving her exposed as the predator she'd always been. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my house, watching Michael attempt to make pancakes for the first time in 3 years. He was living with me temporarily while he underwent therapy and rebuilt his sense of self, but every day he grew a little stronger, a little more like the son I remembered. "Mom," he said, flipping a pancake with the concentration of someone relearning basic life skills, "I need to apologize for something." "You don't need to apologize for anything, honey." "Yes, I do. I chose her over you. I let her convince me that you were the problem, that you were trying to interfere in my happiness. I abandoned my own mother because a sociopath told me to." I set down my coffee cup and looked at my son, really looked at him. The gaunt frame was filling out again, the dark circles under his eyes were fading, and for the first time in years, he was making eye contact when he spoke. "Michael, what Stephanie did to you is called brainwashing. It's a documented psychological phenomenon that breaks down a person's ability to think clearly or trust their own judgment. You didn't choose her over me. You survived the only way you could." He was quiet for a moment, carefully placing the finished pancake on a plate. "The therapist says it might take years to fully recover from what she did to me. Then we'll take years, however long it takes." "And Stephanie?" I smiled, thinking of the news Detective Morrison had shared with me the day before. "Stephanie was sentenced to 8 years in prison. She'll also be required to register as a psychological offender, which means any future romantic partners will be warned about her history. She'll never be able to do this to anyone else." "Good," Michael said. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I heard genuine satisfaction in his voice. She deserves to be as isolated as she made me feel. That afternoon, we received a letter from David Park, the second victim from Stephanie's past. With Stephanie safely imprisoned and unable to retaliate, he'd found the courage to reach out. "Thank you for stopping her," his letter read. "I've been in therapy since her arrest, and for the first time in 3 years, I slept through the night without nightmares. You saved your son, but you also saved me and Brad and whoever would have been next. We're all in your debt." As winter approached again, the first winter in 4 years that my son would spend warm and safe, I reflected on what I'd learned about the nature of real strength. Stephanie had thought strength meant control, domination, the ability to break another person's spirit. She'd mistaken cruelty for power and isolation for victory. But real strength, I'd discovered, was patience. It was the willingness to document injustice methodically, to build cases carefully, to wait for the right moment to act. It was the love that refused to give up, even when giving up seemed easier. Most importantly, it was the understanding that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't dramatic or immediate. Sometimes it's simply ensuring that truth wins over lies, that justice wins over manipulation, and that predators face the same isolation they inflict on others. Stephanie had taught my son to fear the cold, but in the end, it was the cold justice of the legal system that had freed him from her control. And now, finally, we were both warm again,